I wanted to switch gears a little bit because I know a lot of our listeners are tuning in because they want to hear about the relationship between nitric oxide and then stress adaptation, stress resiliency, and mental well-being. So kind of from your research, kind of your experience, how is nitric oxide related to our to the human stress response and then to mental well-being?
Well, it's involved in all that. So mental well-being in any neurological or psychological condition, and this is work by Daniel Amen, who's shown through probably the largest library of human SPECT scans of the brain in the world. But any neurological disease or psychological disease is all characterized by a disruption in the regulation of blood flow to certain regions of the brain. So you can map this out in bipolar patients and anxiety and ADD patients and post-concussion syndrome and Parkinson's. It's all a dysregulation of blood flow to certain regions of the brain. So why is that? Well, it's because your body's not making nitric oxide at the right place at the right time to regulate blood flow to certain regions of the brain upon demand. So it's a nitric oxide deficiency problem. Then the other thing is, if you have chronic stress and increased cortisol levels, this kind of puts your body in a fight or flight response and shuts down nitric oxide production. So your autonomic nervous system, is controlled by nitric oxide, and your autonomic nervous system can release nitric oxide. So it's this two-way street. But the problem is people don't deal with stress, or they're under chronic stress and it's not managed well, and it's wreaking havoc on their body. In order to overcome that, the very first thing you have to do is restore the production of nitric oxide. And it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix everything else. But that's kind of the first step to allow your body to then give it, some neurogenic amino acids like dopamine or tyrosine or whatever it needs to make these excitatory amino acids or neurotransmitters. So the nitric oxide is always the first step. And then from there, you can start interrogating what else, because until you do that, your body's not going to, even if you supplement, your body's not going to get those to where they need to be, because there's clinically shown decrease in nitric oxide production in that region.
So I don't know if you've come across this research or if you have, any understanding of kind of what might be going on here. But, again, my background is in psychophysiology, the human stress response, and then utilizing heart rate variability as the proxy for changes in the nervous system, more particularly in the autonomic nervous system. And one of the things that I've noticed is that once I've increased my overall nitric oxide levels, and I've done this through many things that I mentioned before, but particularly taking like a supplement that is Neo 40, which I've found to be extremely effective, I've noticed these increases in parameters or biometrics of heart rate variability, including my ARM-SSD values, which is a time domain indice of heart rate variability, and my HF or high frequency band. And I didn't know if this was because of the changes that happen in the baroreflex mechanism, or if there's changes in like the vagus nerve or vagal attenuation. Any understanding as to what might be kind of a part of the physiology or role in nitric oxide in the changes of that part of my nervous system?
Well, I think it's on a number of things. So the AV node, which controls kind of your heart rate, in people with arrhythmias, you can have ischemia to that particular region of the heart. And ischemia means decreased blood flow because they're lacking nitric oxide. So that'll affect the electrical conductance of the heart. And we've seen this in patients with chronic arrhythmia. If you restore nitric oxide and give them nitric oxide product, sometimes they'll get into normal sinus rhythm simply by restoring nitric oxide. So you restore blood flow to the AV node or the SA node, and electrical conductance improves. Then the other thing is every major endocrine organ that releases hormones needs nitric oxide as the signal to release the hormones from that endocrine gland. So if you can't make nitric oxide, then the hormone glands don't get the signal that, I need to release testosterone or estrogen, or I need some thyroid stimulating hormone, or, I need some cortisol. Then if you don't have nitric oxide, you get endocrine dysfunction. And so it's all interconnected, but it's based on the signal. And nitric oxide is at its core a signaling molecule. And if you lose an important signal in the body, then bad things happen.
Yeah. It's super intriguing just to kind of watch these biometrics change as I kind of increase my nitric oxide load, and I've liked seeing that. I just was one of those things where like I also didn't know too if like my body hasn't been used to kind of like having this high of a nitric oxide load, so it's kind of having like this like large swing effect in these biometrics, or is this something that's going to be kind of like conditioned and I'll see it go back down because the body will just get used to it? Like when you're, let's say, supplementing using with exogenous types of supplements for nitric oxide, like, is this something that that you see kind of the body just kind of get used to, and the thermostat like ends up changing in that direction? Or do like you see that it continues to have more and more effect the more and more you use it?
Well, I think you're going to get both an acute effect from taking it, and then there's known and published adaptive effects of this. So, and that's really where the performance enhancing effects come in, because it's been shown that it usually takes about 5 days to a week to see the adaptive effects. And so what this means is you have more mitochondria, so it induces mitochondrial biogenesis. So you have more mitochondria utilizing oxygen more efficiently to generate ATP. So that's the adaptive effects and I think even when you get off, the published literature shows that adaptive effect will remain, provided you keep your exercise regimen. Mm-hmm. So I think it's, your body always responds to what you give it. And, too much of something is bad, and too little of something is bad, and too much of something can be bad. So when you overwhelm the system to where the body cannot respond, then, some bad things are going to happen. So I think it's important to titrate in the right amount of nitric oxide. You see these changes. You'll see the acute changes from taking it immediately, but you also see these adaptive changes that have been published.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. In terms of kind of staying with the stress, mental well-being aspects of nitric oxide influence, one thing that I've heard about, both from you and listening to your podcast, as well as hearing from other like breathwork experts, is kind of the role of breathing in nitric oxide, particularly nasal breathing. And I know that James Nestor in his book Breath actually kind of highlighted the importance of nasal breathing and nitric oxide. So is this a truth or a falsehood that kind of increasing kind of deep nasal breathing is effective in increasing nitric oxide, and why so?
Well, the answer is it can, but it doesn't necessarily always does. And so it goes back to this age-related decline in nitric oxide production. So the same enzyme, nitric oxide synthase, that's found in the endothelial cells is also found in the epithelial cells of our nasal airway. And if that enzyme is dysfunctional in the lining of the blood vessel, then it's going to be dysfunctional in the epithelial cells. So you can activate it, stimulate it all day long, but it's never going to produce nitric oxide. And this has been demonstrated in published work that the older you get, the less nitric oxide you can detect from nasal breathing. So what you got to do is you got to restore the function of that enzyme and then start breathing through the nose, generate nitric oxide, and you can, that deep breathing has been shown to lower blood pressure through a nitric oxide mediating mechanism. It has calming effects through a nitric oxide mediated mechanism. So nasal breathing is critically important, but people that do it aren't always generating nitric oxide. You have to fix the enzyme that makes it, and then you can generate nitric oxide when you nasal breathe. Yeah,
basically. So it's like kind of get at the root cause, fix kind of the engine prior to kind of, trying to, it's almost like kind of you got that nasty engine that's not really working because you haven't, changed out the oil. You've been using kind of like crappy gas. And so you're trying to put something into it that's like not going to be that effective. Fix the engine, and then kind of you can add the gasoline that'll make the engine work even more effectively. Is that kind of an okay analogy?
No, that's a perfect example. And it's, I tell people you can't, if you got a blown up engine, you can't put gas in and expect to work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
you got to fix the engine and optimize it to where the body can perform as it's designed to.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for listening to the Hanu Health Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. This podcast would not happen without listeners and supporters like you. And the best way to support us and the show is to head on over to iTunes and provide us with a 5-star review. This helps us reach others and spread the good word of breathing and stress resiliency. If we read your 5-star review on air, please reach out to podcast@hanuhealth.com with your name and mailing address, and we will send you some sweet Hanu gear. Until next time, breathe better and stress less.